Welcome back, Honors. Welcome back to your first. Is this your first flip of the new year? This is your first flip of the new year, right? Yes, that is right. This is the very first flip of 2023, right? And we're diving right back in where we left off in class, talking about the Portuguese heading around Africa, right? So we were starting to talk about our European exploration unit, right? Getting way more in depth, talking about motivations, why they had to go the way they did, why they choose a land by sea instead, or wait, not a land by sea, a route by sea instead of that one by land and stuff like that. Environmental conditions, socio-political, religious decisions, look at all this other crazy stuff going on, right? Talking about man Samusa and the man that is worth $400 billion. And we also just discussed how the Europeans just weren't quite ready to go on a major exploration idea until the 1400s, when all of the stuff of the Renaissance is beginning to take place, when people are beginning to be paid to be more intelligent, when economics are rising in Europe and stuff like that. Because the biggest motivation behind all this stuff was, of course, that of making money, right? Like making money, getting after it, going out there and trying to figure out a way to get into that all-important spice trade, right? Now, the big thing about it, though, in general, just so we can go ahead and discuss this before we move any further, I need you to do me one huge favor, right? Because why are we going to India? Why are spices so important? What's the big flinging deal, right? Well, Luro, go ahead, write these four things down. This is what spices do, right? This is why the Portuguese felt so motivated to try and get to India to infiltrate that spice trade, right? Spices have four uses during the 1400s, during this time period. And one, of course, is flavoring, right? Flavoring something, giving it more like actual like taste associated with like different more luscious foods that wealthy people felt that they could spend like a Ferrari's worth of money on a thing of black pepper to put on their table, right? So the big thing about it though is the flavoring aspect. That's the easy one, right? But they also could be used to be used to do three other things as well. One of them includes making medicine, okay? I don't know about any of y'all, but my grandma used to give me back in the day when I was little, when I got a cold, this thing called a hot toddy, right? And a hot toddy was literally like a warm tea or something like that, and then also some lemon juice and cayenne pepper and stuff like that, and that cayenne pepper would open up my sinuses, cause my nose to run, right? And get all that gunk and phlegm out of my face. So it's like spices have been used as a medicinal property for hundreds and thousands of years, right? Like, so also another big thing they could be used to do is make luxury items, like perfume, right? You can make perfumes and certain scents and things like that out of different spices, right? Out of many different organic materials and things like that. Like, for example, most like spicy things in the fall or the Christmas time are actually used with cinnamon. Cinnamon, a very common spice and a very good smelling one at that, right? Now, another one that you could use it for, last but not least, preserving, right? You can preserve food, help dry it out with the advent of salt a little bit as well. But remember, salt, not a spice. Salt is what made Mansamusa so rich. But the biggest thing that you need to remember in general is that you have to understand that like salt, not a spice, right? Like, so but spices could be used to preserve meats and things like that, right? Now, the thing about it though is that's why the Portuguese felt so particularly advocated to head around Africa and try and infiltrate that spice trade, right? Well, the big thing about it though is who is the guy paying for all this stuff? The Portuguese guy in charge is Prince Henry the Navigator. Now, before we go any further, when we talk about Portugal and Spain, those are our two big countries that we're talking about here, right? Portugal and Spain in the 1400s that are going to try and figure out a way to infiltrate that spice trade and get there as fast as possible. They basically, in essence, begin to race one another because they want to cut who out again? The Italians and the Arabs out of the spice trade. They want to cut those middlemen out because that's just where they are, right? The Arabs and the Italians, because of their location on the map, were the ones that held down the spice trade for so long, right? All the way to the late Middle Ages and then up to like the end of the 1400s. Now, the thing about it, though, is when we talk about these two places, Portugal and Spain, we got to talk about the royals who are going to finance this stuff, right? Well, in Portugal, it's a little bit of a different situation than it was actually in Spain. Portugal was being financed not by their king, but by the king's brother, right? By the king's brother named Prince Henry. Prince Henry is also known as the Navigator, right? Prince Henry, the Navigator of Portugal, is going to be the royal that begins to directly finance voyages and other different excursions to try and get to India to break into that spice trade as soon as possible, to make them as much money as they possibly can. Now, with that, though, he wants to increase Portuguese commercial holdings, right? He wants to create a trade business and an advocate, or like not an advocacy, but a trade business and an advented way to bring in more funds to make the Portuguese economy more stable, make it stronger, and get on par with that of Renaissance Italy by this point, right? Because remember, the Renaissance kind of really truly started in like the 1300s, right? When we talked about Dante, abandon all hope, ye who enter here. He like actually wrote the Divine Comedy in the 1330s, right? So when we're looking at this entire thing, Prince Henry the Navigator wants to expand those like actual outputs, just like the Italians are doing, and get into competition with them, right? He was apparently looking for this river of gold, right? He believed that as they went down the coast of Africa that they might actually be able to access gold deposits, silver, along with spices, and discover many other things that aren't just spices, right? Other commercial holdings as well. One of the biggest things he actually discovered, well, not he, but his sailors that he actually sends out, also discover several uninhabited islands, ones like the Azores Islands, which were discovered by his voyages right off the coast of Africa, right? They were completely uninhabited, and they're right over here, right? And they actually turned out to be a very, very good place for growing sugar, right? So this becomes a big thing as well, is we're seeing the growth of new crops, right? The growth of advantageous new crops that are going to be able to make some other like kind of money like throughout these different areas. Now, sugar was there, right? Like, so sugar was already a product that Europeans had access to, but it's the same similar kind of thing. It has to grow in warm climates, and the climate in Europe is just too chaotic to grow sugarcane there. But if you're finding uninhabited islands off the coast of Africa, you can begin to sell or like plant sugar there, create plantations, and make your own commercial holdings in that area, right? Now, this then brings in the ideas of what our big motivators are, right? Big three things you need to remember for the rest of your existence when we are talking about the growth of the exploration period, right? We are beginning to see the biggest motivators pop up, right? The real motivators, the intrinsic motivators, the actual reasons why these Europeans are doing them. And college professors that you will actually get around, college professors that you will have one day later on, all cook these motivations down into 3 words that start with G, right? Europeans wanted to go out and do this. Prince Henry the Navigator paid for all this stuff because of 3 simple motivators. Gold, or trying to make money. God, or trying to convert people to Christianity. And glory, right? Glory as in the growth of your country and being stronger than your neighbor next door, right? The Portuguese want to be bigger and better than Spain because it's one of their rivals and competitors, right? Glory is a big one. God is a big one. Gold is a big one. But if you ask Mr. Terry, gold's probably the biggest one, right? Because if you want, like, all those other things can come, well, I mean, God doesn't show up with gold, but you understand what I'm saying. Now, they're going to begin to create trade posts, forts, and plantations all along the western coast of Africa, right? Now, it is going to take them decades to get around Africa, all right? This is not a quick thing. They did not just hop on some boats and then start lollygagging around the western coast of Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa is very chaotic, right? There are storms, there are windstorms, there's a lot of crazy stuff going on, of course, also towards the southern coasts of Africa, right? But in this essence, what you need to understand is that they're going to begin to create a trade system around the western coast of Africa, and the big items early on that they are going to begin to trade are gold that they begin to discover on the western coast of Africa, mainly just due to some tribal organizations that live there. And speaking of these tribes, you have to understand another very key important thing that does happen. It then begins the increase of the slave trade from the West African coast, okay? The Portuguese traded more slaves from this time period forward than any other European country in existence, okay? The Portuguese begin to create a very, very, very large infrastructure of slave trade-based systems along the western coast of Africa from their earliest voyages. And so this is going to affect the growth of the American colonies later on when the system known as the encomienda system breaks down, but we'll talk more about that later. And also as like more and more of these plantations and colonies are created on South America and also North America as well. Now we'll talk a big thing about that later on, like where a lot of these like people ended up and stuff like that. But to be point blank period, the Europeans are beginning to now steal Africans away from their native homeland and then bring them to actually be laborers on plantations like the Azores Islands and their sugar plantations. And we'll talk a lot more about that stuff, a lot more in depth, and talk about the disgusting, absolutely disgusting thing that happened in history that was the African slave trade, right? Now, we will get that a little bit later, though, as it begins to develop, but it did begin under Portuguese rule, right? And slavery and sugar by the Portuguese begins to be a very, very large thing. Slavery also, just so you know, existed in European societies for hundreds and hundreds of years, right? As we know already when we talked about the Romans and one of their cataclysmic falls had to do with the importation of slave labor from places like Carthage and then also from conquered territories as well. But the thing that you need to understand is that a lot of this like slave-based systems that were going on in this era, like during the Middle Ages and before, actually were mostly coming from what is known as the Black Sea. Now, the Black Sea is right over towards Turkey and then also over towards Romania. Large body of water that's right over there. And we'll look at it on a map and stuff like that when we get back into class. But that's where the word slave actually comes from. It actually is a derivative of the Roman word Slav or Slavic person, right? A Slavic person is like a Russian or Eastern European, right? So what's going to happen is slavery is going to begin to pivot from a Black Sea base to an African base, right? And a lot of this is due to the fact that the Portuguese voyages are exposing the fact of what we talked about in class the other day. Megan Wolf asked a phenomenal question. She's like, if Mansa Musa was so strong and the African kingdoms there were so strong, then why did like the slave trade system eventually pop up? Such a good question to ask, Megan Wolf, because you're beginning to show elements of that historiography component, right? You're beginning to understand the growth of those things. Ava, I think you asked this question as well. Ava Menardo and I, we discussed this as well. Well, the thing is that as they were pushed down and as the entirety of North Africa began to convert to Muslim and the Muslim empires were actually existing there, the sub-Saharan African regions were very, very tribal still, and the Europeans are going to take advantage of that, right? So going into it, though, also, Portuguese sought to make more money. The big thing that they are, of course, their goal still remains is getting to Asia to get into the spice trade, right? But they had some issues with this, right? So as they begin to move their way down the West African coast and they begin to trade more gold, sugar, and slave-like based systems as well, the thing you need to understand is that they're going to run into some environmental hazards. Windstorms, hurricanes, and a huge amount of wind that comes off the Arctic coast down towards the southern area of Africa. Now, for example, the very first guy to actually get down there is a man by the name of Bartholomew Diaz, right? He actually looked like this. He's a navigator, and as you can see, he is carrying with, there we go. He's actually carrying with him in his hand an astrolabe, right? And Bartholomew Diaz is the very first Portuguese sailor to actually reach the most southern tip of Africa, right? He gets all the way down to the very, very southern tip of Africa, and he's going to be the very first person that attempts to open the door to India. But the thing is he turned around and came back. He never actually fully crossed the southern coast of Africa, southern tip of Africa, and got all the way to India, because when he came back, they were like, Bartholomew, why did you not go all the way to India? You were all the way there. Why didn't you get there? And he goes, well, it's because this area at the southern tip of Africa should be known as the Cape of Storms, right? Because he lost at least one boat in these storms that were going on and raging through the southern area of Africa, right? Down towards what is now the country of South Africa, okay? So what ends up going down, though, is he turns around and comes back. But then, a few years later, in 1497, another sailor comes along by the name of Vasco da Gama, and he becomes the very first Portuguese sailor to try and make the trip all the way to India and all the way back, right? And he is going to be the very first person that does this successfully. He takes 4 boats and 170 men all the way there, and he spices sail for a ton of money. He also committed several atrocities and killed a bunch of people in the process to try and bribe the Indian people to open their ports. But Vasco da Gama goes all the way around the southern tip of Africa and comes all the way back. And after his successful voyage that took 4 years, by the way, after he did this entire thing, what ends up happening is they rename that southern tip of Africa. Instead of the Cape of Storms, they call it the Cape of Good Hope, right? So the Cape of Good Hope, because Vasco da Gama was like, look, if you can make it past that, it's a straight shot to India, it's a straight shot back, right? So the thing about it, though, is a lot of his men did actually die from a disease known as scurvy and stuff like that, but we'll talk about that a little bit later on as well. Scurvy is a really, really bad sickness you can get when you don't have enough vitamin C in your system. But because of the voyages of Vasco da Gama and Bartholomew Diaz and the financing of Prince Henry the Navigator and things like that, the Portuguese become the suppliers for all things Eastern after allying with Indian rulers and also then bombarding other areas and forcibly opening them. Now, when we're looking at this different stuff right here, as you can see, they are sticking mostly to the coastal ports of India. But in this process, when Spain and Portugal were racing against each other to try and get to India, the Portuguese are going to be the ones that get there first. Now, a lot of this also has to do with the fact that this dum-dum comes along, right? This guy shows up, and he is the guy that is going to sail for Spain to try and figure out his way of getting all the way to India and all the way back. But the thing about it is, never actually gets there. And of course, who we're about to talk about now, today, a little bit, and then also as we go forward in class, is none other than the guy Christopher Columbus. Right now, Christopher Columbus, who is, first and foremost, we don't even know if this is what he looks like. So apparently this is the only popular portrait of Christopher Columbus, but we don't even know if this is actually him, okay? So something that we need to kind of expose about Christopher Columbus is he's actually not really that big of a deal, right? Like big of a deal in the sense of the things that he did were much more accidental. Like, he ended up dying in shame because he was arrested by the Spanish government and then brought back to Spain after 4 of his voyages, and then all of his findings would then be handed over to the Spanish royals. He actually got involved in this whole thing just because of where he was from, and he didn't like Venice and like all this other stuff. He's also not Spanish, he's Italian, right? And another big thing about it is he's one of the biggest atrocity committers that we'll talk about in history, right? His actions and the actions of his colonists would lead to the death of 95% of the Native Americans in the Caribbean islands, of these people known as the Taino people. But let's go ahead and start opening up this entire story and talk about Spain's involvement now. So we just talked about Portugal. And now we're going to talk about Spain. Ignore this for a hot second, okay? We're going to talk about the motivation here in a second. But what are some things that you already know about Columbus? See, this is what I'm getting at, right? Usually I do this in class, right? That's why it says on board, get it? Now, the big thing about it, though, is the things that you already know about Columbus is probably a very limited and finite amount, right? We have a holiday named after a guy that most school children can't even name more than 2 facts about him, right? More than things being like, well, he sailed in 1492 because of this goofy rhyme that I learned in Miss What's-Her-Face's class, or Mr. What's-Her-Face's class. And also, the other thing I know is that, he discovered America, quote unquote. First of all, he never once stepped foot in what is now known as the continental United States, right? Never once went to Florida or Louisiana or anywhere on the eastern coast of what is now the United States of America. He didn't discover America. First of all, he landed in the Caribbean, right? So now the big thing about it that you need to understand is that there are important items that you do need to know about him. 1, he's Italian. 2, he sails for Spain. And 3, his discovery was an accident because of his idea. His idea was he was planning on going west. He went out to the Spanish royals by the name of Ferdinand and Isabella. Write their names down. They're very important. The Spanish royals at the time, the king and queen of Spain, are Isabella and Ferdinand, okay? Now, the thing about it with Isabella and Ferdinand, they're going to become big players as we go later on. But the thing about it is, Isabella and Ferdinand decide that they are going to give Columbus this voyage after a lot of different people actually told him no, okay? So the important items that you need to know about him is that, and also his idea was to sail west and then show up on the other side of the earth. He did not think that the earth was flat, okay? We talked about that already in class. He was planning on showing up and popping up towards Japan and then bouncing all the way down around to India, right? And then he ran into everything on accident, right? He ran into the Caribbean on complete accident. Also, there are other items that you probably don't know about him, right? First and foremost, he's Genoese, right? Which means he's from this place called Genoa, right? So Genoa is a city on the western coast of Italy, and they had a massive rivalry with the Venetians, right? The ports of Venice that are on the eastern coast of Italy, right? They have this huge rivalry with them because Venice is the big importer, right? They're the merchant city that's built on canals that brings in all these different goods from Arab communities, from the Ottomans, from the Byzantines, all the way back and sells them into Europe for tons and tons of money. Hence why, of course, the Renaissance is going to begin in Italy, right? Well, Genoa always wanted to break into this entire thing, right? They wanted to break into this entire thing. They want to try to go through the Black Sea. They came up with a lot of ideas. They apparently at one point sent 6 boats out into the Atlantic to try and see what else was out there, to try and figure out it on their own. But none of them ever came back, right? So the thing about it is Columbus, being from Genoa, has this big idea where he's like, I'm going to sail west, pop up on the other side. He goes up to multiple different other countries. He went to France, he went to Genoa, he went to multiple other city-states in Italy, and everybody kept saying, no, dum-dum, this sounds like a bad idea. Until he stumbles upon Isabella and Ferdinand of Spain. Now, they didn't tell him no at first, but he was just particularly persistent, and he just kept coming up to them multiple times, being like, please, I think this is a good idea. Please, I think this is a good idea. And they're going to actually tell him, fine. But here's the deal. You get 3 boats, the Nina, the Pinta, the Santa Maria. You get those 3 boats, and you get 10% of whatever you find. We get the rest of it. We get the other 90, okay? Columbus takes this deal, because in the long run, 10% of a spice trade deal, it's a lot of money, right? Because in his idea, he's going to end up in India, right? He's also going to use Christianity to enslave a nonviolent group of people when he does land in the Bahamas after 3 months on his voyage, because he actually ends up in the Caribbean, and these people are known as the Taino people. We will talk more about all this stuff with this crazy story about Columbus in general and fill in a lot of these holes when I see y'all again in class. See y'all on Tuesday. Y'all have a great one.